A viewer asked us a question after the Jamaican Maroon episode that turned out to lead somewhere we hadn't planned on going. Is there an actual genetic connection between the Gullah people of the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands and the population of Jamaica? On the surface, these are two communities that don't obviously belong in the same sentence. One lives on a chain of low-lying islands off the coast of the continental United States. The other is an independent Caribbean nation more than 1,000 miles away. What population geneticists found when they actually sat these two communities side by side wasn't just a connection. It was one of the tightest genetic relationships found anywhere in this entire series, and it came with a pattern neither community fully expected. The Gullah, sometimes called Geechee further south along the Georgia and Florida coast, are descendants of enslaved Africans who worked the rice and indigo plantations of the Sea Islands, a string of barrier islands stretching from North Carolina down to Florida. Their relative geographic isolation, cut off from the mainland by marsh and tidal creek for generations, allowed them to preserve a distinct Creole language and cultural practices with unusually deep, traceable African roots. For decades, a specific origin story has circulated among linguists, historians, and the Gullah community itself, that their ancestors came disproportionately from what's known as the Rice Coast, the traditional rice-growing region of West Africa stretching from Senegal down through Sierra Leone and Liberia, a theory built on striking linguistic overlap between Gullah Creole and Sierra Leone's Creole language, along with shared rice cultivation techniques, quilting patterns, and oral storytelling traditions. Jamaica's population, formed through an entirely separate colonial and plantation history under British rule, has never been folded into that same specific Rice Coast narrative in the same way, making the comparison a genuinely open question rather than an assumed conclusion. Given how differently these two populations formed, one shaped by rice plantation labor on isolated barrier islands within the continental United States, the other by sugar plantation slavery on a much larger Caribbean island under a different colonial administration entirely, you might reasonably expect their genetic profiles to diverge fairly significantly, sharing only the broad, general West African ancestry common to nearly every African-descended population in the hemisphere. Before we get to what researchers actually found, it's worth sitting with why a viewer would even think to ask this question in the first place. Culturally, Gullah and Jamaican traditions do share certain surface-level resonances, particular musical rhythms, certain folk beliefs, elements of Creole grammar, the kind of overlap you'd expect from any two populations built substantially from West African source populations funneled through the same broad slave trade system. But surface cultural resonance and precise genetic relatedness are two very different things, and this channel has spent enough episodes now showing how often those two things fail to line up. A mitochondrial DNA study, conducted by researchers including Kittles and colleagues, compared maternal genetic lineages across 5 distinct populations: Sierra Leoneans in West Africa, Jamaicans, Gullah-speaking African Americans of the South Carolina Sea Islands, non-Gullah African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, and African Americans on the west coast of the United States. The results showed something specific enough to settle the viewer's question directly. Jamaicans and the Gullah turned out to be the two populations most closely genetically related to Sierra Leoneans of any group in the study, more closely related to that specific West African population than either Charleston or West Coast African Americans, despite Charleston sitting geographically much closer to the Gullah Sea Islands than Jamaica does. Here's a question worth sitting with before we explain the mechanism behind it. If Jamaica and the Gullah developed under completely separate colonial systems on different land masses, thousands of miles apart, why would they end up more genetically similar to each other, and to Sierra Leone specifically, than either is to other African American populations living right next door? The answer traces back to a factor this channel keeps returning to in different forms: isolation, and specifically, isolation from continued genetic mixing with the wider colonial population after the initial founding generations arrived. The same study found that maternal European genetic admixture measured strikingly low in both Jamaica at just 2% and the Gullah at just over 6%, compared to nearly 10% in Charleston African Americans and just over 20% in West Coast African American populations, a clear, stepped pattern rising the further a population moved from its geographically isolated origin point. Jamaica's plantation demographics and geographic separation as an island nation, and the Gullah's marsh and tidal creek isolation on the Sea Islands produce strikingly similar outcomes through entirely different mechanisms. Both populations experienced far less generational dilution from European admixture than African American communities that became more thoroughly integrated into the wider, more continuously mixing colonial and post-colonial population around them. If a question like the one that started this episode is exactly the kind of thing you've been wondering about your own family's history or a place you're curious about, send it in, because this entire episode exists because someone asked, and we're always looking for the next question that turns into something this specific. Subscribe if you want to see where the next one leads, and drop your own question in the comments, because there's a real chance it becomes the next video on this channel. A separate, more recent genome-wide study, published in 2021, adds further weight to this specific connection using different methodology entirely. Researchers analyzing the broader genomic ancestry of Gullah African Americans using principal component analysis across autosomal markers rather than mitochondrial lineages alone, found the Gullah clustering distinctly closer to Sierra Leone and Senegal's Mandenka population than non-Gullah African Americans, who clustered instead closer to the Yoruba of Nigeria. This confirms the earlier mitochondrial finding using an entirely independent genetic method, strengthening the case that the Rice Coast origin story isn't simply a compelling piece of folklore built on linguistic coincidence, but a pattern with real, replicated genetic support behind it, now documented twice, using two different kinds of DNA evidence roughly a decade apart. What ties this back to Jamaica specifically is worth stating plainly. The same isolation mechanism that let the Gullah preserve an unusually clear genetic signal also applies independently to Jamaica as a whole. Jamaica's own population history, including the Maroon communities this channel has already covered in a separate episode, involves distinct genetic subplots of its own, but at the broader national level, the same reduced European admixture that shows up in the Gullah shows up in Jamaica too, both populations acting as a kind of genetic time capsule relative to more continuously mixed African American communities living just a few hundred miles inland from the Gullah Sea Islands themselves. It's worth adding one more layer of specificity here, because the mitochondrial study didn't stop at broad national comparisons. When researchers looked more closely at the maternal haplotypes shared between Sierra Leoneans, Jamaicans, and the Gullah, they found low overall genetic differentiation among the three New World African-derived populations themselves, meaning Jamaica and the Gullah weren't just independently close to Sierra Leone, they were also unusually close to each other directly, closer than either was to other African-descended populations elsewhere in the Americas. That detail matters because it rules out a simpler explanation you might otherwise reach for, that both populations simply happen to draw from a similar general pool of West African source regions by coincidence, the way most transatlantic slave trade populations share broad overlapping origins. Instead, the data points towards something closer to two populations preserving the same specific, narrower ancestral signal with unusual fidelity, rather than two populations that merely started from a similar broad starting point and drifted apart from there. It's worth explaining a bit more about why Sierra Leone specifically became the geographic anchor point for the Rice Coast theory, because the historical logic behind it is more precise than a simple regional guess. Rice cultivation along the West African coast, particularly in the tidal, brackish river deltas of what is now Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau, required specialized agricultural knowledge, understanding tidal flooding cycles, constructing earthen dikes, managing salinity in paddies, that European planters arriving in the Carolina Lowcountry simply did not possess. Historical records show colonial planters specifically sought enslaved people from this region precisely because of that expertise, advertising for captives from the Rice Coast in ways that functioned almost like a targeted labor recruitment for a skill European colonizers could not replicate on their own. That same specific, documented preference toward one narrow West African coastal region is part of what gives the genetic findings their added weight. This wasn't a broad, undifferentiated capture of people from anywhere convenient along the coast, but a targeted pattern shaped by economic self-interest, and the DNA evidence lines up with that targeted historical pattern rather than contradicting it. The Jamaican side of this comparison carries a slightly different economic logic worth noting as well. Sugar, not rice, drove Jamaica's plantation economy, meaning the island didn't share Carolina's specific incentive to seek out Rice Coast expertise in the same targeted way. That Jamaica still shows this close, a genetic relationship to Sierra Leone, despite a different agricultural economic driver, suggests the connection may run through broader Upper Guinea Coast trade patterns rather than through rice. Specifically, a detail that future comparative work between Jamaica, the Gullah, and Sierra Leone could help clarify further, particularly if researchers expand beyond mitochondrial lineages into fuller genome-wide comparisons across all three populations directly, something that, as of this recording, still hasn't been done in one unified study. This growing body of research has already started shaping real-world cultural exchange. Sierra Leone and Gullah Geechee communities have developed formal heritage tourism partnerships specifically built around this connection, organized trips bringing Gullah descendants to Sierra Leone to trace language, food, and now genetic threads back to their most likely point of origin, treating the Rice Coast story not as an assumption to be taken on faith, but as a documented relationship, increasingly backed by hard genetic data on both sides of the Atlantic. What this episode adds to the series is something a little different from most. Not a single population's hidden history, but a documented, replicated genetic thread quietly connecting two communities that most people would never think to place in the same conversation, held together across 4,000 miles by nothing more than the specific way each of them, for very different reasons, ended up left alone by history long enough for an old signal to survive intact. It's the kind of answer that started as one viewer's curiosity and turned into a documented scientific relationship spanning 2 studies, 2 decades, and 2 entirely different genetic methods, which is about as good a reminder as this channel can offer, that the questions worth chasing down don't always come from a researcher's agenda. Sometimes they come from someone in the comments who noticed a connection nobody had bothered to properly check.